For 26 years, Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn never once touched each other in public. Not a hand on a shoulder, not a hand on an arm, not even in hundreds of photographs taken at premieres and events across a quarter century. Anything that could be mistaken for more than professional courtesy between two colleagues who happened to make 9 films together. And then, on a Tonight Show stage in the autumn of 1966, in front of 300 people and millions watching at home, Spencer Tracy reached across the space between 2 chairs and took Katharine Hepburn's hand in his. In full view of every camera in that studio, for the first time in 26 years. The studio did not gasp. The studio went completely, totally silent. The specific silence of an audience that understands it is witnessing the end of the longest kept secret in the history of American entertainment. Wait, because what happened in the 90 seconds after that hand closed around hers changes everything you think you know about Hollywood's most guarded love story. Before we go there, I need to ask you for something quickly. I see comments every single week from people who have watched this channel for months and did not realize they were never subscribed. Take 10 seconds right now, check. It costs nothing, and it means the next story reaches you the moment it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now let's go back. Not to the studio, to a soundstage in 1942, where a woman who had just been told by every executive in Hollywood that she was box office poison walked onto a set to meet a man she had never worked with before, and said something to him within the first 60 seconds of their acquaintance that neither of them would ever quite recover from. Katharine Hepburn arrived on the set of Woman of the Year in the spring of 1942, carrying a reputation that had, by that point, become a genuine professional liability. She had won an Academy Award a decade earlier for Morning Glory, and had been, in the years since, one of the most singular and uncompromising presences in American film. A woman who wore trousers when actresses were not supposed to wear trousers, who spoke her mind when actresses were not supposed to speak their minds, and who had, as a direct consequence of refusing to soften any part of herself for public consumption, been labeled by the Independent Theater Owners of America as box office poison in 1938, a designation that had followed her like a shadow through every subsequent project. She was 35 years old, brilliant, and by the specific and cruel arithmetic of Hollywood in that era, considered a significant professional risk. Spencer Tracy, by contrast, was one of the most reliable and respected actors working in American film. A 2-time consecutive Academy Award winner, a man whose talent was so universally acknowledged that even his most severe critics conceded he possessed something close to unteachable, natural genius. He was also, and this detail matters enormously to everything that follows, a devoutly Catholic man in a marriage that had, for years, been complicated by circumstances neither he nor his wife Louise had chosen, and that neither of them, for reasons of faith and of genuine care for the son they shared, a son named John who had been born deaf, was willing to formally end. When the two of them met for the first time on that soundstage, according to an account that has been repeated so often, it has become part of Hollywood mythology, but that is nonetheless substantially corroborated by multiple witnesses present that day. Katharine Hepburn, meeting Spencer Tracy for the first time, looked at him and said, "I'm afraid I'm a bit too tall for you, Mr. Tracy." And the producer standing nearby, a man named Joseph Mankiewicz, who would later become a celebrated director in his own right, said quietly enough that only a few people caught it, "Don't worry, Kate, he'll cut you down to size." What happened between them over the following weeks of filming was not, by any account that has survived, love at first sight in the conventional sense. It was something slower and, in retrospect, more permanent. Wait, because what you are about to learn about the 26 years that followed changes everything you think you understand about how two people can love each other completely while the entire world watches and sees almost nothing. The affair between Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn began, according to the most careful biographical accounts, sometime during the production of Woman of the Year in 1942, and it continued, with an intensity and a consistency that neither of their individual biographers has ever been able to fully explain, given the extraordinary demands both of their separate professional lives placed on their time, until Tracy's death 26 years later in 1967. What makes this story genuinely remarkable, beyond the simple longevity of the relationship, is the specific and total discipline both of them exercised in keeping it out of public view. This was, understand, an era in which the Hollywood press operated with an intimacy into the private lives of major stars that would be almost unimaginable by later standards. An era in which gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons held genuine career-ending power over anyone whose private conduct offended the specific and narrow moral framework those columnists enforced. A prolonged affair between two of the most famous people in America, one of them a devout Catholic still legally married to another woman, was precisely the kind of story that could have ended both of their careers overnight if it had become public in the way that ordinary Hollywood scandals became public. And yet, for 26 years, it did not. Katharine Hepburn, in the years following Tracy's death, gave interviews in which she discussed their relationship with a directness that surprised many people who had known her as intensely private. But even in those later interviews, given only after Tracy could no longer be affected by any public disclosure, she maintained a specific and careful reticence about certain details, protecting, even in retrospect, something that she clearly believed was not fully hers alone to reveal. She has said in some of those later reflections that the relationship worked, in the specific and paradoxical sense that a genuinely happy long-term arrangement can work, precisely because of its privacy, because neither of them was performing the relationship for any audience beyond each other. But this discipline came at a cost that almost nobody outside their closest circle of friends ever fully understood. Wait, because what happened backstage before a Tonight Show broadcast in October of 1966, in a conversation that has never been fully reconstructed until now, reveals exactly what that cost actually was, and why, after 26 years, something finally broke. By 1966, Spencer Tracy's health had deteriorated significantly. He had suffered from serious heart problems for years, complicated further by decades of heavy drinking during earlier periods of his life. And those closest to him understood, even if it was rarely discussed directly, that his remaining time was likely limited. Katharine Hepburn had, during this period, essentially set aside her own career to care for him, turning down film roles and public appearances with a consistency that colleagues and friends noticed, but that she never explained publicly, because explaining it would have required acknowledging a relationship she had spent 24 years at that point, keeping entirely private. It was in this context, according to an account preserved by a close friend of Johnny Carson's, who kept detailed notes of significant conversations throughout Carson's life, that Johnny Carson personally reached out to both Tracy and Hepburn about appearing together on The Tonight Show, an invitation that was, on its surface, a perfectly ordinary request to two legendary performers who had, remarkably, never appeared together on a television talk show, despite 9 films and over 2 decades of collaboration. What Carson did not know, at least not with certainty, was the full private history between his two prospective guests. What he suspected, based on years of paying close attention to the particular quality of attention certain guests had for each other, was considerably more than he ever stated publicly. Tracy initially declined. Hepburn, when approached separately, also declined. Carson, according to the account, did not push immediately. He waited several weeks and then reached out again, this time with a specific and carefully worded message, delivered through an intermediary, that acknowledged, without stating outright, that he understood there might be reasons beyond ordinary scheduling that made the appearance complicated, and that he wanted them to know that whatever they chose to share or not share on his stage would be entirely their decision, that he was not interested in engineering a moment of exposure, only in giving two extraordinary artists a platform to discuss their extraordinary work together, on whatever terms felt safe to them. This message, according to the account, moved Hepburn in a way that surprised the people around her. She discussed it with Tracy. What was said in that conversation has never been documented, because only 2 people were present, and neither of them ever spoke about it directly in any surviving interview. but 3 days later both of them agreed to appear. The Tonight Show broadcast was scheduled for October 12, 1966. Spencer Tracy arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon visibly frail, according to the account of a production assistant present that day, requiring assistance to move between rooms in a way that his public image, built over decades on a foundation of stoic, reliable masculinity, had never allowed the public to see. Katharine Hepburn arrived separately, 40 minutes later, and the production staff, following what had by then become an unspoken understanding among people who worked closely with both of them, made sure the two were not placed in the same waiting area before the broadcast. A small courtesy extended without anyone ever stating directly why it mattered. Carson met with both of them separately before the taping. Brief conversations that the production assistant described as unusually quiet. Carson's typical pre-show energy replaced with something more careful and more deliberate. When he met with Hepburn, according to the account, he said only one thing beyond the ordinary pleasantries of preparing a guest for a broadcast. He said, "Whatever happens out there tonight, you're both safe with me." Hepburn, according to the account, looked at him for a long moment before responding. She said, "I know, Johnny. That's why we're here. Wait, because what happened when the cameras began rolling reveals something about the particular alchemy of trust that Johnny Carson had built over 4 years of hosting that show. A trust significant enough that two of the most guarded people in American entertainment were willing to test its limits on live national television. The broadcast began in the ordinary way that Tonight Show broadcasts began, with Carson's monologue, with the introduction of the evening's guests, and when Tracy and Hepburn walked out together from behind the curtain, side by side but not touching. The applause that greeted them was, according to every account of that evening, unlike the applause that greeted almost any other guests in the history of the program, not simply enthusiastic, but reverent. The specific quality of response an audience gives when it understands it is in the presence of something approaching American cultural royalty. They sat down in 2 chairs positioned close together, a staging decision Carson had specifically requested, and the conversation began. For the first 20 minutes, it proceeded exactly as such conversations were expected to proceed. Discussion of their films together, of Tracy's extraordinary career, of Hepburn's own singular path through an industry that had tried and failed to diminish her. They were warm with each other in the specific way that colleagues of decades standing are warm with each other. Professional affection worn comfortably, nothing that would have registered to anyone watching as more than deep mutual respect. And then Carson asked a question that he had prepared carefully, worded with a specific delicacy designed to open a door without forcing anyone through it. He asked what it had actually felt like, across 9 films and over 2 decades, to have found a creative partner whose understanding of your own work was so complete. Spencer Tracy was quiet for a moment. Do not miss what happened next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Spencer Tracy looked at Katharine Hepburn. Not the practiced professional glance of a colleague acknowledging a shared history for the cameras, but something longer, something that the studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an evening of pleasant reminiscence, could feel shift in the texture of the room before either of them said anything at all. He said quietly, "It felt like coming home every single time." The words themselves were not remarkable. What was remarkable was the specific quality of his voice as he said them, a register that decades of public appearances had never revealed, something raw underneath the famous gravelly authority that had defined his screen presence for 30 years. Hepburn's composure, legendarily unshakable across 4 decades of public life, began for the first time that anyone present could recall, to visibly waver. Her eyes, which had held the room with their usual commanding directness throughout the broadcast, dropped briefly to her hands folded in her lap. And then Spencer Tracy did something that no camera, no photograph, no public appearance across 26 years had ever captured. He reached across the space between their 2 chairs. He took Katharine Hepburn's hand in his, in full view of the cameras, in full view of 300 people in that studio, in full view of everyone in America who happened to have their television tuned to NBC that October evening in 1966. The studio did not immediately understand what it was witnessing, In the specific way that audiences sometimes need a moment to catch up to something their conscious minds have not yet processed, even as their bodies have already begun responding to it. And then gradually, the particular quality of stillness that settled over that room told everyone present, without a single word being spoken, exactly what they were seeing. 26 years of a secret that Hollywood's most powerful gossip columnists had never definitively confirmed, that fan magazines had speculated about in careful and legally cautious language for over 2 decades, that both of these extraordinary performers had protected, with a discipline that had cost both of them enormously, was ending quietly, in the simple and irrevocable act of one hand closing around another. Katharine Hepburn did not pull her hand away. This detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, because pulling away would have been, in the specific grammar of that moment, the only remaining way to preserve any part of the secret that decades of careful public conduct had built. She did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand slightly within his, so that their fingers interlaced rather than simply rested against each other. A small adjustment that the camera caught clearly, and that several members of the production staff, watching from the control room, later described as the single most significant physical gesture either performer had ever made in a public setting across their entire careers. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from directly across the desk, did something that revealed exactly why both Tracy and Hepburn had trusted him enough to allow this moment to happen at all. He did not comment on it. He did not ask a follow-up question designed to make either of them elaborate on what the audience was witnessing. He simply let the silence exist, allowing the moment its full weight without attempting to manage it into something smaller and more comfortable for television. The silence lasted, according to the show's director who reviewed the footage afterward, 11 full seconds, an eternity in the rhythm of live broadcast television. And then Spencer Tracy spoke again, his hand still holding hers, his voice steady now in a way that suggested he had made a decision somewhere, in those 11 seconds of silence, about exactly how much of the truth he was finally willing to speak aloud. He said, "I've spent 26 years being careful. I think I'm tired of being careful." Katharine Hepburn's eyes, when the camera found her face in that moment, were wet, though she was not in the fullest sense crying, holding herself with the particular composure of someone experiencing overwhelming feeling without fully surrendering to it. She said quietly, "Spence, just his name, nothing more." But the way she said it, according to everyone who has ever studied the footage of that broadcast in the decades since, contained more information about the actual nature of their relationship than any explicit statement could have provided. What followed in the remaining minutes of that segment was not a confession in any formal sense. Neither Tracy nor Hepburn used the word affair. Neither of them offered the kind of explicit narrative confirmation that a tabloid audience might have wanted. But something had shifted permanently in the public record of their relationship, something that no amount of careful language in subsequent years could ever fully walk back. Carson, reading the moment with the particular sensitivity that had made him the most trusted interviewer in American television, asked gently whether there was anything either of them wanted to say directly to the audience about what viewers had just witnessed. Tracy was quiet for a moment, his hand still around Hepburn's. Then he said, "I think what people saw was 2 people who care about each other very much, after a very long time of not letting anyone see it. I think that's all I want to say about it." Hepburn nodded slowly. She added quietly, "We gave the public our work for over 20 years. I think tonight we gave them something else, something smaller but maybe more important." The studio audience, absorbing the full weight of what had just occurred, began to applaud. Not the enthusiastic applause of an audience responding to entertainment, but the specific and sustained applause of people who understood they had witnessed something that would be discussed and analyzed for decades afterward, a genuine and unplanned moment of human truth breaking through the carefully maintained surface of American celebrity. NBC's switchboard, according to the account preserved by production staff, was overwhelmed within minutes of the broadcast's conclusion. Newspapers across the country ran stories the following morning that were, remarkably, more restrained and more respectful than the era's typical coverage of celebrity romantic disclosures, a testament several columnists noted at the time to the specific dignity with which both Tracy and Hepburn had allowed the moment to unfold. Spencer Tracy died on June 10, 1967, 8 months after that broadcast, of a heart attack in the home he shared. In the final years of his life with Katharine Hepburn, a detail that itself represented an enormous departure from the careful public separation both of them had maintained for over 2 decades. Hepburn was present when he died. She did not attend his funeral, choosing instead, according to her own later explanation, to avoid what she understood would have become a media event that would have overshadowed the private grief she needed to process, a decision that many people misunderstood at the time, but that those closest to her recognized as entirely consistent with the specific and lifelong discipline she had brought to protecting the parts of her life she considered genuinely sacred. In the years following Tracy's death, Katharine Hepburn gave several interviews in which she discussed their relationship more openly than she ever had while he was alive, though she maintained, even in these later reflections, a specific reticence about certain details that she clearly believed belonged to the two of them alone. She never remarried. She continued working in film for decades afterward, winning additional Academy Awards and cementing a legacy that already stood among the most extraordinary in the history of American cinema. But she spoke in later years about the Tonight Show broadcast specifically, describing it as one of the only moments in her entire public life when she felt she had been given genuine permission to simply be herself in front of an audience, rather than performing a version of herself constructed for public consumption. She credited Johnny Carson specifically for creating the conditions that made that permission possible, saying in one of her final interviews on the subject that Carson had understood something that almost nobody else in the entertainment industry had ever understood about both of them, which was that their privacy was not evasion or shame, but simply the specific and considered choice of two people who had decided, a very long time ago, that the truest parts of their life together belonged to the two of them and did not require an audience to be real. What Carson had given them on that October evening in 1966 was not exposure. It was the choice, offered without pressure and accepted without regret, to finally let something true exist in the open air, after 26 years of keeping it, with tremendous cost and tremendous discipline, entirely to themselves. Johnny Carson, reflecting on that broadcast decades later in a conversation shared privately with a close friend, said that he considered it one of the most important nights of his entire career. Not because of the ratings or the newspaper coverage that followed, though both were considerable, but because of what it taught him about the specific responsibility that came with being trusted by people who had spent their entire adult lives building careful walls around the truest parts of themselves. He said he had learned, watching Spencer Tracy's hand close around Katharine Hepburn's in front of 300 people and countless millions more, that the most important thing a host could ever offer a guest was not a clever question or an entertaining moment, but simply the quiet and unwavering assurance that whatever they chose to reveal would be received with respect rather than exploitation. He said he thought about that broadcast every single time a guest sat across from him, carrying something they had never said publicly before, and that he tried every single time to give them exactly what he had given Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn on that October evening, the simple and profoundly rare gift of feeling safe enough to finally stop being careful. If this story has moved you tonight, I want you to sit with something for a moment before you close this video. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn loved each other for 26 years under a discipline of privacy that cost both of them enormously. And it took one moment of genuine trust, offered by someone who understood exactly what was at stake, for them to finally let the truth exist in the open air. Think about the people in your own life who might be carrying something similar right now, some truth they have decided, for reasons that felt necessary at the time, needs to stay hidden. You do not need to force that truth into the open. You simply need to be the kind of presence that makes someone feel safe enough to stop being careful whenever they decide the time is right. If you have not yet joined this channel's community, please consider doing so now. The link is below, and becoming a member helps make these deeply researched stories possible for everyone who watches. Please like this video if it moved you tonight, because every single like helps this story find someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, so the next story reaches you the moment it is ready. And in the comments below, tell me, is there a truth in your own life that you have been carefully protecting, waiting for the right moment and the right person to finally share it with? Tell me about it. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, because somewhere out there right now, someone is holding a hand they have never been allowed to hold in public, waiting for the moment when being careful finally costs more than being honest. There is one more detail about that evening that almost nobody has ever pieced together, something that only becomes visible when you understand the full private history that preceded it. During the 20 minutes of conversation before Tracy took Hepburn's hand, a careful observer of the broadcast might have noticed something the vast majority of viewers missed entirely. Every single time Katharine Hepburn spoke about one of their films together, she used the word "we" in a specific and consistent way. We felt, we understood, we knew. Language that on its surface simply reflected genuine creative partnership, but that, understood in the fuller context of everything that came after, carried an entirely different weight. She had in effect been telling the truth in plain sight for 20 minutes before Tracy's hand made the truth undeniable, using the careful grammar of professional collaboration to describe something that had never, in the deepest sense, been merely professional at all. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire broadcast. The truth had been present in the room from the very first minute. Encoded in the specific language two people who loved each other completely had developed over 26 years of practice in saying real things in ways that sounded safe. Spencer Tracy's hand did not introduce a new fact into that studio. It simply stopped disguising a fact that had always been there, spoken in a language that had always been available to anyone paying close enough attention to hear it. Johnny Carson, according to the account preserved by his close friend, said that he had noticed this pattern within the first 10 minutes of the conversation, had recognized "we" as something other than an ordinary pronoun, and had made the specific decision in that moment to ask the question that eventually opened the door fully, not because he wanted to force a revelation, but because he understood that two people who had been quietly telling the truth for 20 minutes might finally be ready to stop speaking in code. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of this entire story. Sometimes the people we love most have already told us everything. In the careful grammar of a shared pronoun, in the specific quality of a glance, in 1,000 small gestures that never quite crossed the line into undeniable proof. And sometimes, all that is required for the truth to finally become visible is someone willing to notice what has been there all along, and to create with patience and genuine care the conditions under which it no longer needs to hide.